Hi, and welcome to Mediatwits number 151. I'm Mark Glazer, Executive Editor of PBS Mediaship. Today we'll be talking about a new change, a possible change in the Google algorithm for search called the Knowledge Vault, which would actually judge pages on truthfulness rather than links. What this means for online publishers, news sites, and others if this does go into effect by Google. First, a word from our sponsor. Running your own business requires focus, so does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. And I am indeed at the Next Space co-working space, and my son Everett is next door in Next Kids. So before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our panel this week. We have Hal Hodson joining us from New Scientist, Joanna Rothkopf joining us from Salon, Lily Hay Newman at Slate, and our producer Jefferson Yen from Los Angeles. So, Hal, first, explain to us what this Knowledge Vault is all about and how this differs from current Google search results.
Well, it's about it's really about digesting the information that is out there on the web in a way that makes it readable for machines. Currently, when you search for something, I mean, there's lots of complicated stuff going on in the Google search algorithm, and most people don't even, this is broad strokes we're talking, but still, when you search for something, the links that are shown to you are determined by who else links to them. It's kind of a popularity contest. And the Knowledge Vault, what it does is try and look at all the different information on the internet and try and digest these into sets of facts called triples. It's kind of a data science-y term, but it basically means something like Barack Obama born Kenya is a false triple. Barack Obama born United States is a true triple. So that's very roughly what are the kinds of things that are going into the Knowledge Vault. And Google has sort of natural language processing technologies that can pull those triples out of almost any web page. They can pull them off Wikipedia. There's already a big database called Freebase, which already has a bunch of these triples in it. But Google is now doing it on their own turf.
Okay, and so what does that mean for the way sites will be ranked now? If it's according to kind of these truthful facts, what does that mean for a lot of different sites?
Well, I mean, the first disclaimer, just to address something that a lot of people brought up, is that Google is not doing this. This is not a Google product, and I know a lot of people have brought that up. However, not yet. However, Google itself began as a research paper in 1998 or 99 in Stanford. So for Google to say, oh, it's just research, it's nothing to do with us, is kind of spurious. It's like, well, you're paying for it, and you started from a paper just like it. So chill out with your removal from this. But it would mean potentially that if you had a page that was dense in these true triples, dense in facts, that page would rise to the top of this hypothetical ranking algorithm. Presumably, Google would not just wholesale replace whatever systems they have with this new single research paper that's coming out in, I think it's coming out in the Knowledge Discovery. The acronym is KDD. It's very much a backwater of academia, but it is real stuff. It would mean that the stuff that has a lot of facts that Google deems to be true would rise up in their ranking, and a lot of stuff that Google deems to be false would fall down. There's been a lot of the debate, and I assume you're going to get to this later, but there's a lot of discussion about, like, Google can't tell me what's true. Google isn't allowed to do that. And I mean, there's a semantics issue about the word truth, for sure, quite a big one. But if they're going around and saying, the sky is blue and that's a true fact, then fine. But I would imagine they're not going to do things like, X politician is a liar as a true fact. Like, that doesn't really make sense. But there's a lot of facts out there that most people agree are true. And there's probably some pretty controversial ones that are on the fence about whether, like the autism stuff, But yeah, I'm sure we'll get into all of that.
Yeah, for sure. Lily, what do you think about this idea that we're going to allow, I mean, I don't know if we're going to allow it, but Google deciding what's true or an algorithm deciding what's true? I mean, is there some danger in that?
I think it's potentially, I mean, it's a great area to be researching in for sure. I think that's why Google's trying to draw the line and say we're not implementing this now, because certainly there's a ton of misinformation on the web that contributes to political discourse and social issues and things that impact individuals every day. So I think it's worthwhile to try to find a way, if we can, to sift through and say, well, here's what's true and here's what's not. But I do think, as with any algorithmic application, you know, it's always dangerous, especially with something as subjective as the truth. It's always a little dangerous because there could be unintended consequences or ways that the algorithm is making decisions that end up weighting certain information more heavily than others when both are true, or, you know, it's just really hard, especially on such an enormous scale of data, to quite foresee how everything would shake out, especially when you have, and the reason I agree that it would have to only be one factor is that on the web you have lots of things that present similar information and are factual. You know, many newspapers or many online news outlets reporting similar things with slightly different takes or whatever, and so you have to have additional elements in order to rank things that are so similar. So I think it's a great direction, but I definitely think that there have to be other considerations too if it were implemented.
And how do you think that would affect publishers and news sites? I mean, you know, they're supposedly all true, but there's humor sites, there's, you know, people being contrarian. You know, does that
Right.
mean that, you know, people who are kind of questioning the truth are going to be, you know, down in the page rank?
Well, exactly. I think that's a legitimate concern. And again, if it were implemented and if the research moves forward and shows progress, they would have to figure out, Google and, I don't know, other search engines potentially, would have to figure out how to sort of massage things so that it's only one factor. Because, right, you know, Horowitz Report or something is going to have a terrible time if this is how things are ranked. And I also think that, you know, for the most part, we're trying to combat misinformation because it's wrong, but sometimes common knowledge and you know, common wisdom actually isn't true, and so it's complicated to say, well, you know, if the algorithm is saying, well, there's so much support for this, everyone says this, reputable sites say this, but it's actually not true, it's going to make those ideas even more inveterate and make it harder to do fact-checking on that type of misleading common wisdom. So I think it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. And what about these early tests? Joanna, you had written about this kind of test that Google's been doing in medical search. Tell us a little bit about that and how it's worked out.
Well, that actually, I think that takes like the best case scenario of what this could be applied for and puts it into action. The way it works is that it's curated a bunch of medical topics, and it's gotten the input of doctors in the Mayo Clinic. And so if you Google measles, you're going to get, the first result is going to be scientifically accurate information. But that, I mean, it's different from the truth rankings in that it's not necessarily covering up the anti-vax, skeptical, conspiracy theorists. It's just saying this is information that comes from experts. We're going to show it to you first. And I think that kind of is an ideal scenario for how this could work. Because, I mean, it's taking a topic where there is, to a large degree, there's medical truth, like, who knows what will be disproved in, like, the next decades and hundreds of years or something, but as far as we know, this is how disease works. We're going to give you the absolute best information and put it right at the top, so like a conspiracy theory doesn't really have a chance to get to you first. And I think in medicine that's awesome and great. But obviously the implementation of this truth ranking would be very different.
Right. And if there's experts involved in it, I mean, you're saying there's some human intervention, and what the knowledge vault sounds like that's, I mean, obviously humans create an algorithm, so it's not a machine deciding things. It's been programmed, but I mean, maybe there is a need for human intervention to some extent to not to check to make sure the knowledge vault is on track.
I mean, I have to imagine so. I mean, science is evolving. New studies are coming in. I mean, I'm just thinking about it from a science and medicine perspective. Like what is true today will not necessarily be true in a month, and if it's just culling information from past journals, that's not necessarily going to be correct. So you do. I mean, yeah, you have to have human oversight to regulate something that's so dependent on shifting culture. I mean. It's also a question, but yeah.
Yeah. Hal, I'm curious what your take is on what they've done so far with this kind of medical test on information, and also, you know, some of the pitfalls in the system, and you know how things that could go wrong, I guess.
Well, this is something I've actually looked into quite deep, well, in reasonable depth recently. I did a big feature about the biases that algorithms can introduce into the world without anyone really knowing it. And there's lots of weird examples, like the State Department runs a lottery for green cards. And I can't remember if it was last year or this year, it's in my story, but there was a glitch when they first started to automate it. It's a lottery, and they had previously done it in a more old-fashioned way. And when they automated it, they accidentally gave these green cards only to sort of people with a certain set of numbers within the application queue. So it meant that effectively only the first 1,000 people had any chance of getting one, or something like that. And that was unintentional, you know. There's a lot of question, or I think a lot of people, when they think about algorithms, they think about, oh, evil Google doing this, or evil Facebook intentionally, you know, screwing me over in some way. But I'd be pretty surprised if that was the case. Like, Google's a giant corporation that really doesn't want to look stupid and evil, ideally. So I think in most cases, these systems just really complicated, and Google are losing track. I mean, I've spoken with data engineers who've gone up to Google and said, we've studied your systems and we found these biases, and Google said, well, thank you, because we don't study our own systems like that. So that's interesting to us.
Yeah, and Lily, I mean, we've heard a lot about that Google, in doing this with fact-based system, you know, has some sort of liberal bias, and you know, there's a lot of complaints from climate change denier sites and things like that. I mean, is there something to this, you know, and this came up with Wikipedia too, and the way it decides on facts and what goes into it. I mean, are there bias problems?
I think so. When we were talking before about experts, you know, people can always have experts on both sides of everything. So I do think that it does involve companies taking a little bit of a stand, even if they don't mean to, as they're trying to uncover, you know, quote unquote, the truth, which might be part of why Google is being so defensive about saying we're not implementing this right now. So I think, you know, that is a reality. Also, you know, some of this in a small way has already been implemented in Google services through the sort of Knowledge Vault's predecessor, the Knowledge Graph. You know, if you Google a prominent figure or someone famous, Michael Jackson or something, a little information card comes up with a sort of digested rundown of basic facts that you might be looking for about that person. So already we're starting to see these decisions implemented in a small way. And I mean, you know, maybe personally I think Google would do a great job, or I think they do a terrible job, and therefore I support it or don't. But the fact is that you have to come down somewhere on what is the truth if you're going to have an algorithm that's making decisions.
And you're listening to the Mediatwits. I'm Mark Glazer. We also have Hal Hodson from New Scientist, Joanna Rothkopf from Salon, Lily Hay Newman from Slate Magazine. So what about these facts, these kind of questionable or controversial facts? I mean, this is something that Wikipedia, I remember with their George W. Bush entry, you know, people just kept changing it around back and forth about, well, you know, the war and different facts. So what about controversial subjects? I mean, how can a truth vault or a knowledge vault deal with that, Joanna?
I mean, there are a number of ways. I don't necessarily think, I mean, from an ethical standpoint, it's hard to support the stifling of information and having there be one truth when events are so much more complicated than that. That's just going to pose a problem in most of journalism, except for, I don't know, in rare cases. So, I mean, this is not something that's been proposed, but I mean, I would think that a truth score would be more helpful. Or, I mean, I just think it's such a complicated issue. So I guess for a controversial subject, I guess if you take Ferguson, for example, there's so many contrasting accounts of what's happened. And I guess just the inclusion of information is going to increase its truths. I mean, I don't know how the algorithm works. Hal would know better than I. But I think it has to be more dependent on the amount of good information that's included rather than the conclusion a certain article comes to.
Right, and this is just about ranking too. You know, whatever the other things are, they might also be on the page, but it's really just what shows up near the top, and that's typically what most people will click on is the top few links.
Right, I mean, and that's why it's so complicated saying that something is better than something else. I mean, there are things that are clearly less competent and less responsible, and things that clearly emit information. I think that's where this is more useful rather than towards like a jumble of similarly reported things that are all going to show up somewhere near the top.
Yeah.
I don't know how it would be implemented.
Right. Hal, I mean, do you think this is kind of a victory for science in a way that, you know, we're not going to have a lot of the kind of people questioning a lot of, you know, evolution and all the other things that have been questioned? I mean, is this kind of, if this is implemented, I mean, it's always an if, but we can kind of figure that something like it will be implemented eventually. I mean, would that be something that scientists are pretty happy about?
I think it's a really difficult question, as Joanna's saying. Yes, on the face of it, yes. There's a lot of good that could come from it. I think, you know, there are still lots of keywords where if you Google them, you get things that are not just not true, but like harmful. And I think if there are some things that Google or any other tech company can do, like, you know, we're just talking about Google now, and that's good because, you know, there's a lot out there, but there's lots of systems out there that surface information to us in ways that we're not very familiar with because we've only been doing it for 10 years. And so I think it's good to be thinking about different ways that we can filter that information and different ways that it might work. I think where it gets uncomfortable for everyone, I'm pretty sure, is when we're talking about like dissenting views and controversial opinions. And I don't know the answer to that. The idea that you would just leave people out of the loop is definitely not good. I mean, maybe there's something in like the kind of question you're asking Google. Like if you're trying to ask Google, like, I'm sick, what should I do? I personally would not want to be getting results about like you should dilute a small amount of the flu virus in water 10 million times and then drink that. Like I would, you know, I don't think that would be a good thing to have, but I don't know. Maybe Google can use personalization stuff to deliver the kinds of results people are looking for. I don't know. I mean, it kind of comes down to whether or not you want a dictatorial like society or not, whether you want Google telling you things or not. And I think people should be allowed to choose whether they want Google telling them things or not. Well, not Google, because Google's just one company. People should be allowed to choose whether they want their society to push things on them heavily or not. They shouldn't have to just knuckle under to what everyone else says, even if I think it's stupid.
Right, and I mean this is also about Google's power in this area, you know, because they wanted to be the keeper of all knowledge. Now that they've kind of won in the search wars, they really do have a hell of a lot of power that hasn't really been reined in very much. Yeah,
well, I mean, I think that's maybe the hidden thing that we're not talking about that maybe we should be. We wouldn't be having this discussion if this was just some startup that were like, we're going to rank the web according to truth. Like, people would just be like, oh, cool, that could be neat. But because it's Google, because it's almost a bigger deal than anything else, I can't really imagine another organization making an announcement like this that would be more of a big deal. So maybe that's really the question we should be asking ourselves. I know there's a lot of people you know, you have the monopoly discussion about Google, and people are like, oh, well, it's definitely not a monopoly, at least not in the traditional sense. But if you think about where people get their information from, if you think about the number of bytes of information a human takes into their brain through their eyes every day, I would say Google probably has a monopoly on the delivery of that, at least for, I don't know, I mean, I'm kind of just talking shite here, but like, roughly.
Yeah, and let's talk about some other companies because Facebook also has kind of changed its algorithm around to try to rank, you know, quality content instead of, you know, what it considers to be link bait and junky kind of content. I mean, is that also something we should be looking at, Lily?
Yeah, definitely. Facebook's changes have made a big impact on publishers and presumably on what average users are seeing. And I think, you know, there's a little bit of talk about how Yahoo search has been gaining a little bit of ground ever since default search in Firefox got changed away from Google, you know, so there is a little bit of movement that could potentially make it possible for another company to share the power. But, you know, like Hal said, I agree that currently Google definitely has a lot of real estate on our attention right now. I also wanted to mention to Joanna's point that in the original study that we're talking about, proposing the, you know, truth-based search ranking approach, they were calculating what they called a knowledge-based trust score. So they were trying to nod to a score style, and I think you know, Facebook in its implementation of trying to reduce, clickbait, like you were saying, and some of the other services, they are, I think, thinking of it in that way because, like Joanna says, it makes more sense than like a cut and dried, you know, yes or no, right or wrong. But all the sites, you know, all the big sites are grappling with this, I think, how to surface content in a way that is productive and truthful, but also what the users want. It's a tough thing to balance.
Yeah, and Joanna, what do you think about this when Google and Facebook and these other kind of large companies have so much power as to, you know, show us what we want, and they're basically picking winners when they decide what goes to the top. I mean, they meaning an algorithm that they created, but you know, they kind of decide, and when they change their algorithm, there's a lot of losers usually.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's tricky. That's one of the pitfalls from of having these huge tech giants control by default what we see, as Hal was saying. I mean, I don't know. All we can do right now before this is implemented, and just in a theoretical sense, you can hope they're going to handle it the right way. And I mean, already certain things are promoted that we wouldn't want to be promoted. There's so much that goes into it in terms of, I mean, I don't know the specifics, but there's so much that goes into a search engine ranking that it's not objective. It's not, this is what people want. That we're already to a certain extent dealing with it. Unless somebody's going to start a grassroots search engine that's perfect, like that's something we have to deal with. I don't know what I don't know what else to say. Like my Facebook newsfeed is already so like corporate, and I mean like so influenced by things that I haven't chosen. We can only hope that if a truth ranking or something like this is implemented, it's not going to be what certain conspiracists fear it's going to be. I don't know what to say other than that. Like we can only hope that Google has the best intentions for us.
As usual. Well,
Yeah.
Thanks for the discussion. It was really good. I want to thank our guests, Hal Hodson at New Scientist, Joanna Rothkopf at Salon, Lily Hay Newman at Slate, our producer Jefferson Yen. I want to thank PBS and the Knight Foundation and our sponsor, NextSpace and NextKids. You can learn more about their program at nextspace.us/nextkids, and you can catch us each and every Friday at the Mediatwits on PBS Media Shift at pbs.org/mediashift. I'm Mark Glazer. Have a great weekend, and we'll catch you next week.